Chapter 26. The external relations of Alexey Alexandrovitch and his wife had remained unchanged. The sole difference lay in the fact that he was more busily occupied than ever. As in former years, at the beginning of the spring he had gone to a foreign watering place for the sake of his health, which was depleted by the winter's work that every year grew heavier. And just as always, he returned in July, and at once fell to work as usual with increased energy. As usual, too, his wife had moved for the summer to a villa out of town, while he remained in Petersburg. From the date of their conversation after the party at Princess Verskaya's, he had never again spoken to Anna of his suspicions and his jealousies, and his habitual tone of bantering mimicry was now the most convenient tone possible for his present attitude to his wife. He was a little colder to his wife. He simply seemed to be slightly displeased with her for that first midnight conversation which she had repelled. In his attitude to her there was a shade of vexation, but nothing more. "You would not be open with me," he seemed to say, mentally addressing her. "So much the worse for you. Now you may beg as you please, but I won't be open with you. So much the worse for you," he said mentally, like a man who, after vainly attempting to extinguish a fire, should fly into a rage with his vain efforts and say, "Very well, then, you shall burn for this." This man, so subtle and astute in official life, did not realize all the senselessness of such an attitude to his wife. He did not realize it because it was too terrible for him to realize his actual position. So he shut down and locked up and sealed up in his heart that secret place where lay his feeling towards his family, that is, his wife and son. He who had been such a careful father had from the end of that winter become unusually frigid to his son, and adopted to him just the same bantering tone he used with his wife. "Aha, young man," was the usual greeting with which he met him. Alexey Alexandrovitch asserted and believed that he had never in any previous year had so much official business as that year. But he was not aware that he sought work for himself that year, and this was one of the means for keeping shut that secret place where lay hid his feelings towards his wife and son, and his thoughts about them, which became more terrible the longer they lay there. If anyone had had the right to ask Alexey Alexandrovitch what he thought of his wife's behavior, the mild and peaceable Alexey Alexandrovitch would have made no answer, but he would have been greatly angered with any man who should question him on that subject. For this reason there positively came into Alexey Alexandrovitch's face a look of haughtiness and severity whenever anyone inquired after his wife's health. Alexey Alexandrovitch did not want to think at all about his wife's behavior, and he actually succeeded in not thinking about it at all. Alexey Alexandrovitch's permanent summer villa was in Peterhof, and the Countess Lydia Ivanovna as a rule used to spend the summer there, close to Anna, and constantly seeing her. That year the Countess Lydia declined to settle in Peterhof, was not once at Anna Arkadyevna's, and in conversation with Alexey Alexandrovitch hinted at the unsuitability of Anna's close intimacy with Betsy and Vronsky. Alexey Alexandrovitch sternly cut her short, roundly declaring his wife to be above suspicion, and from that time began to avoid the Countess Lydia. He did not want to see, and he did not see, that many people in society cast dubious glances on his wife. He did not want to understand, and did not understand, why his wife had so insisted on staying at Tsarskoe, where Betsy was staying, not far from the camp of Vronsky's regiment. He did not allow himself to think about it, and he did not think about it. But all the same, though he never admitted it to himself, and had no proof, not even suspicious evidence, in the bottom of his heart he knew beyond all doubt that he was a deceived husband, and he was profoundly miserable about it. How often during those 8 years of happy life with his wife, Alexey Alexandrovitch had looked at other men's faithless wives and other deceived husbands, and asked himself, how can people descend to that? How is it they don't put an end to such a hideous position? But now, when the misfortune had come upon himself, he was so far from thinking of putting an end to the position that he would not recognize it at all. He would not recognize it just because it was too awful, too unnatural. Since his return from abroad, Alexey Alexandrovitch had twice been at the country villa. Once he dined there. Another time he spent the evening there with a party of friends, but he had not once stayed the night there, as it had been his habit to do in previous years. The day of the races had been a very busy day for Alexey Alexandrovitch, but when mentally sketching out the day in the morning, he made up his mind to go to their country house to see his wife immediately after dinner, and from there to the races, which all the court were to witness, and at which he was bound to be present. He was going to see his wife because he had determined to see her once a week to keep up appearances. And besides, on that day, as it was the 15th, he had to give his wife some money for her expenses, according to their usual arrangement. With his habitual control over his thoughts, though he thought all this about his wife, he did not let his thoughts stray further in regard to her. That morning was a very full one for Alexey Alexandrovitch. The evening before, the Countess Lydia had sent him a pamphlet by a celebrated traveler in China who was staying in Petersburg, and with it she enclosed a note begging him to see the traveler himself, as he was an extremely interesting person from various points of view, and likely to be useful. Alexey Alexandrovitch had not had time to read the pamphlet through in the evening, and finished it in the morning. Then people began arriving with petitions, and there came the reports, interviews, appointments, dismissals, apportionment of rewards, pensions, grants, and notes. The work-day round, as Alexey Alexandrovitch called it, that always took up so much time. Then there was private business of his own, a visit from the doctor and the steward who managed his property. The steward did not take up much time. He simply gave Alexey Alexandrovitch the money he needed, together with a brief statement of the position of his affairs, which was not altogether satisfactory, as it had happened that during that year, owing to increased expenses, more had been paid out than usual, and there was a deficit. But the doctor, a celebrated Petersburg doctor, who was an intimate acquaintance of Alexey Alexandrovitch, took up a great deal of time. Alexey Alexandrovitch had not expected him that day, and was surprised at his visit, and still more so when the doctor questioned him very carefully about his health, listened to his breathing, and tapped at his liver. Alexey Alexandrovitch did not know that his friend Lydia, noticing that he was not as well as usual that year, had begged the doctor to go and examine him. "Do this for my sake," the Countess had said to him. "I will do it for the sake of Russia, Countess," replied the doctor. "A priceless man," said the Countess. The doctor was extremely dissatisfied with Alexey Alexandrovitch. He found the liver considerably enlarged, and the digestive powers weakened, while the course of mineral waters had been quite without effect. He prescribed more physical exercise as far as possible, and as far as possible less mental strain, and above all, no worry. In other words, just what was as much out of Alexey Alexandrovitch's power as abstaining from breathing. Then he withdrew, leaving in Alexey Alexandrovitch an unpleasant sense that something was wrong with him, and that there was no chance of curing it. As he was coming away, the doctor chanced to meet on the staircase an acquaintance of his, Sludin, who was secretary of Alexey Alexandrovitch's department. They had been comrades at the university, and though they rarely met, they thought highly of each other and were excellent friends, and so there was no one to whom the doctor would have given his opinion of a patient so freely as to Sludin. "How glad I am you've been seeing him," said Sludin. "He's not well, and I fancy... Well, what do you think of him?" "I'll tell you," said the doctor, beckoning over Sludin's head to his coachman to bring the carriage round. "It's just this," said the doctor, taking a finger of his kid glove in his white hands and pulling it. "If you don't strain the strings and then try to break them, you'll find it a difficult job. But strain a string to its very utmost, and the mere weight of one finger to the strained string will snap it. And with his attention to detail, his conscientious devotion to his work, he's strained to the utmost. And there's some outside burden weighing on him, and not a light one," concluded the doctor, raising his eyebrows significantly. "Will you be at the races?" he added, as he sank into a seat in the carriage. Yes, to be sure. It does waste a lot of time," the doctor responded vaguely to some reply of Sludin's he had not got. Directly after the doctor, who had taken up so much time, came the celebrated traveler, and Alexey Alexandrovitch, by means of the pamphlet he had only just finished reading and his previous acquaintance with the subject, impressed the traveler by the depth of his knowledge of the subject and the breadth and enlightenment of his view of it. At the same time as the traveler, there was announced a provincial marshal of nobility on a visit to Petersburg, with whom Alexey Alexandrovitch had to have some conversation. After his departure, he had to finish the daily routine of business with his secretary, and then he still had to drive round to call on a certain great personage on a matter of grave and serious import. Alexey Alexandrovitch only just managed to be back by 5 o'clock, his dinner hour, and after dining with his secretary, he invited him to drive with him to his country villa and to the races. Though he did not acknowledge it to himself, Alexey Alexandrovitch always tried nowadays to secure the presence of a third person in his interviews with his wife. Chapter 27. Anna was upstairs, standing before the looking-glass, and with Annushka's assistant pinning the last ribbon on her gown, when she heard carriage wheels crunching the gravel at the entrance. "It's too early for Betsy," she thought, and glancing out of the window, she caught sight of the carriage and black hat of Alexey Alexandrovitch, and the ears that she knew so well sticking up each side of it. How unlucky! Can he be going to stay the night? She wondered, and the thought of all that might come of such a chance struck her as so awful and terrible that without dwelling on it for a moment she went down to meet him with a bright and radiant face, and conscious of the presence of that spirit of falsehood and deceit in herself that she had come to know of late, she abandoned herself to that spirit and began talking, hardly knowing what she was saying. "Ah, how nice of you," she said, giving her husband her hand and greeting Sludin, who was like one of the family, with a smile. "You're staying the night, I hope," was the first word the spirit of falsehood prompted her to utter. "And now we'll go together. Only it's a pity I've promised Betsy. She's coming for me." Alexey Alexandrovitch knit his brows at Betsy's name. "Oh, I'm not going to separate the inseparables," he said, in his usual bantering tone. "I'm going with Mihail Vasilyevich. I'm ordered exercise by the doctors, too. I'll walk, and I fancy I'll visit the springs again." "There's no hurry," said Anna. "Would you like tea?" She rang the bell. "Bring in tea, and tell Seryoza that Alexey Alexandrovitch is here. Well, tell me now, how have you been?" Mihail Vasilyevich, you've not been to see me before. Look how lovely it is out on the terrace," she said, turning first to one and then to the other. She spoke very simply and naturally, but too much and too fast. She was the more aware of this from noticing in the inquisitive look Mihail Vasilyevich turned on her from time to time, as it were, keeping watch on her. Mihail Vasilyevich promptly went out onto the terrace. She sat down beside her husband. "You don't look quite well," she said. "Yes," he said. "The doctor's been with me today and wasted an hour of my time. I feel that some one of our friends must have sent him. My health's so precious, it would seem." "Oh, no. What did he say?" She questioned him about his health and what he had been doing, and tried to persuade him to take a rest and come out to her. All this she said brightly, rapidly, and with an unusual brilliance in her eyes. But Alexey Alexandrovitch did not now attach any special significance to this tone of hers. He heard only her words, and gave them only the direct sense they bore, and he answered simply, though jestingly. There was nothing remarkable in all this conversation, but never after could Anna recall this brief scene without an agonizing pang of shame. Seryozha came in, preceded by his governess. If Alexey Alexandrovitch had allowed himself to observe, he would have noticed the timid and bewildered eyes with which Seryozha glanced first at his father and then at his mother. But he would not see anything, and he did not see it. "Ah, the young man. He's grown. Really, he's getting quite a man. How are you, young man?" And he gave his hand to the scared child. Seryozha had been shy of his father before, and now, ever since Alexey Alexandrovitch had taken to calling him young man, and since that insoluble question had occurred to him whether Vronsky were a friend or a foe, he avoided his father. He looked round towards his mother as though seeking shelter. It was only with his mother that he was at ease. Meanwhile, Alexey Alexandrovitch was holding his son by the shoulder while he was speaking to the governess, and Seryozha was so miserably uncomfortable that Anna saw he was on the point of tears. Anna, who had flushed a little the instant her son came in, noticing that Seryozha was uncomfortable, got up hurriedly, took Alexey Alexandrovitch's hand from her son's shoulder, and kissing the boy, led him out onto the terrace and quickly came back. "It's time to start," she said, glancing at her watch. "I wonder why Betsy doesn't come." "Yes," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, and getting up, he folded his hands and cracked his fingers. "I've come to bring you some money, too, for nightingales, we know, can't live on fairy tales. You want it, I expect?" "No, I don't. Yes, I do," she said, not looking at him, and crimsoning to the roots of her hair. "But you'll come back after the races, I suppose?" "Oh, yes," answered Alexey Alexandrovitch. "And here's the glory of Peterhof, Princess Tverskaya," he added, looking out of the window at the elegant English carriage with the tiny seats placed extremely high. "What elegance! Charming! Well, let us be starting too, then." Princess Tverskaya did not get out of her carriage, but her groom, in high boots, a cape, and a black hat, darted out at the entrance. "I'm going. Goodbye," said Anna, and kissing her son, she went up to Alexey Alexandrovitch and held out her hand to him. "It was ever so nice of you to come." Alexey Alexandrovitch kissed her hand. "Well, goodbye then. You'll come back for some tea? That's delightful." And she went out, gay and radiant. But as soon as she no longer saw him, she was aware of the spot on her hand that his lips had touched, and she shuddered with repulsion. Chapter 28. When Alexey Alexandrovitch reached the racecourse, Anna was already sitting in the pavilion beside Betsy, in that pavilion where all the highest society had gathered. she got sight of her husband in the distance. Two men, her husband and her lover, were the two centers of her existence, and unaided by her external senses, she was aware of their nearness. She was aware of her husband approaching a long way off, and she could not help following him in the surging crowd in the midst of which he was moving. She watched his progress towards the pavilion, saw him now responding condescendingly to an ingratiating bow, now exchanging friendly, nonchalant greetings with his equals, now assiduously trying to catch the eye of some great one of the world, and taking off his big round hat that squeezed the tips of his ears. All these ways of his she knew, and all were hateful to her. Nothing but ambition, nothing but the desire to get ahead. That's all there is in his soul, she thought. As for those lofty ideals, love of culture, religion, they are only so many tools for getting ahead. From his glances toward the ladies' pavilion, he was staring straight at her, but did not distinguish his wife in the sea of muslin, ribbons, feathers, parasols, and flowers. She saw that he was looking for her, but she purposely avoided noticing him. "Alexey Alexandrovitch," Princess Betsy called to him, "I'm sure you don't see your wife. Here she is." He smiled his chilly smile. "There's so much splendor here that one's eyes are dazzled," he said, and he went into the pavilion. He smiled to his wife as a man should smile on meeting his wife after only just parting from her, and greeted the princess and other acquaintances, giving to each what was due. That is to say, jesting with the ladies and dealing out friendly greetings among the men. Below, near the pavilion, was standing an adjutant general of whom Alexey Alexandrovitch had a high opinion, noted for his intelligence and culture. Alexey Alexandrovitch entered into conversation with him. There was an interval between the races, and so nothing hindered conversation. The adjutant general expressed his disapproval of races. Alexey Alexandrovitch replied, defending them. Anna heard his high measured tones, not losing one word, and every word struck her as false and stabbed her ears with pain. When the 3-mile steeplechase was beginning, she bent forward and gazed with fixed eyes at Vronsky as he came up to his horse and mounted, and at the same time she heard that loathsome, never-ceasing voice of her husband. She was in an agony of terror for Vronsky, but a still greater agony was the never-ceasing, as it seemed to her, stream of her husband's shrill voice with its familiar intonations. "I'm a wicked woman, a lost woman," she thought, "but I don't like lying. I can't endure falsehood. While as for him," her husband, "it's the breath of his life, falsehood. He knows all about it. He sees it all. What does he care if he can talk so calmly? If he were to kill me, if he were to kill Vronsky, I might respect him. No, all he wants is falsehood and propriety," Anna said to herself, not considering exactly what it was she wanted of her husband, and how she would have liked to see him behave. She did not understand either that Alexey Alexandrovitch's unusual loquacity that day, so exasperating to her, was merely the expression of his inward distress and uneasiness. As a child that has been hurt skips about, putting all his muscles into movement to drown the pain, in the same way Alexey Alexandrovitch needed mental exercise to drown the thoughts of his wife that in her presence and in Vronsky's, and with the continual iteration of his name, would force themselves on his attention. And it was as natural for him to talk well and cleverly as it was natural for a child to skip about. He was sane. Danger in the races of officers, of cavalrymen, is an essential element in the race. If England can point to the most brilliant feats of cavalry in military history, it is simply owing to the fact that she has historically developed this force, both in beast and in men. Sport has, in my opinion, a great value, and as is always the case, we see nothing but what is most superficial. "It's not superficial," said Princess Verskaya. "One of the officers, they say, has broken 2 ribs." Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled his smile, which uncovered his teeth but revealed nothing more. "We will admit, Princess, that is not superficial," he said, "but internal. But that's not the point." And he turned again to the general, with whom he was talking seriously. "We mustn't forget that those who are taking part in the race are military men who have chosen that career, and one must allow that every calling has its disagreeable side. It forms an integral part of the duties of an officer. Low sports, such as prize fighting or Spanish bullfights, are a sign of barbarity, but specialized traits of skill are a sign of development." "No, I shan't come another time. It's too upsetting," said Princess Betsy. "Isn't it, Anna?" "It is upsetting, but one can't tear oneself away," said another lady. "If I'd been a Roman woman, I should never have missed a single circus." Anna said nothing, and keeping her opera glass up, gazed always at the same spot. At that moment a tall general walked through the pavilion. Breaking off at what he was saying, Alexey Alexandrovitch got up hurriedly, though with dignity, and bowed low to the general. "You're not racing?" the officer asked, chaffing him. "My race is a harder one," Alexey Alexandrovitch responded deferentially. And though the answer meant nothing, the general looked as though he heard a witty remark from a witty man, and fully relished it. "There are 2 aspects," Alexey Alexandrovitch resumed, "those who take part and those who look on. And love for such spectacles is an unmistakable proof of a low degree of development in the spectator, I will admit. But—" "Princess Bets," sounded Stepan Arkadyevitch's voice from below, addressing Betsy. "Who's your favorite?" "Anna and I are for Kuzolov," replied Betsy. "I'm for Vronsky. A pair of gloves?" "Done. But it is a pretty sight, isn't it?" Alexey Alexandrovitch paused while they were talking around him, but he began again directly. "I admit that manly sports do not," he was continuing. But at that moment the racers started, and all conversation ceased. Alexey Alexandrovitch, too, was silent, and everyone stood up and turned towards the stream. Alexey took no interest in the race, and so he did not watch the racers, but fell listlessly to scanning the spectators with his weary eyes. His eyes rested upon Anna. Her face was white and set. She was obviously seeing nothing and no one but one man. Her hand had convulsively clutched her fan, and she held her breath. He looked at her and hastily turned away, scrutinizing other faces. "But here's this lady, too, and others very much moved as well. It's natural," Alexey Alexandrovitch told himself. He tried not to look at her, but unconsciously his eyes were drawn to her. He examined that face again, trying not to read what was so plainly written on it, and against his will, with horror, read on it what he did not want to know. The first fall, Kuzalov's at the stream, agitated everyone, but Alexey Alexandrovitch saw distinctly on Anna's pale, triumphant face that the man she was watching had not fallen. When, after Mahotin and Vronsky had cleared the worst barrier, the next officer had been thrown straight on his head and fatally injured, and a shudder of horror passed over the whole public, Alexey Alexandrovitch saw that Anna did not even notice it, and had some difficulty in realizing what they were talking of about her. But more and more often, and with greater persistence, he watched her. Anna, wholly engrossed as she was with the race, became aware of her husband's cold eyes fixed upon her from one side. She glanced round for an instant, looked inquiringly at him, and then, with a slight frown, turned away again. "I don't care," she seemed to say to him, and she did not even once glance at him again. The race was an unlucky one, and of the 17 officers who rode in it, more than half were thrown and hurt. Towards the end of the race, everyone was in a state of agitation, which was intensified by the fact that the Tsar was displeased.